Hard as rock, lasts forever. Wow, the aftertaste hits the back of your throat very hard indeed. Why would you do that? It's just grim. Salve, I'm Dan Snow, and I've just had a busy day civilizing the natives here in the Roman province of Britannia. And today I'm going to be eating a typical meal provided to a Roman officer in that army of occupation. Let's get into the eating position. The ancient Romans originally came from Rome, but they ruled over a vast empire that stretched way beyond that city or even the confines of Italy. The Roman Empire covered land from the Middle East, North Africa, all around the Mediterranean, into North and West Europe, and even parts of Great Britain from 43 AD till around 410. And as they won more battles and conquered more lands, the empire got bigger. Now, counting auxiliary soldiers, there could have been around 1 million men in the Roman army. The life of a Roman soldier was tough. They had to endure hostile natives who were defending their homelands from invasion or occupation. They had to undertake grueling marches across rough and dangerous terrain. They had to deal with severe weather, lack of food, arduous battles. To survive all that, the Romans needed a hearty diet. A lot of what we know about that Roman diet comes from something called the Codex Theodosianus, a compilation of Roman laws published in 438. It stated that during expeditions, a Roman soldier should be supplied with bucellatum ac panem vinum, quoque atque atticum, sed et laridum carnem verbecianum, or hardtack and bread, wine too and vinegar, but also bacon and mutton. So today I'm eating hardtack biscuits, a refreshing drink of posca, wild boar, some mashed parsnip, bacon, and a delicious slice of cheese. Hardtack biscuits was the staple, a simple biscuit that was very, very hard. It's made from flour, salt, and water. Hard as rock, lasts forever, baked twice at very low temperatures. The great thing about this is you can cook a lot of this in your main base and then send it out with the army if it goes on a long campaign. And it'll last for months, even years. If you send out bread, it will go stale and mouldy. If you send out flour, it'll spoil, especially in this damp British climate. So hardtack is your carbohydrates. This tastes like you're eating a bit of stone. And so one of the great pastimes of the Roman army was find something to dip this in, whether it's a drink or some stew, anything to make this staple a little bit more exciting. The Latin name for this was bucellatum, biscuit, and Roman soldiers became so synonymous with this, they became known as bucellari, which means biscuit eaters. The Romans are famous drinking wine, but in Britain, soldiers probably would have had something called posca. This delicious drink here, let's test it out. That, if anything, has made the biscuit even less edible. Posca is made by mixing wine with vinegar, with water, and with honey. Why would you do that? It's just grim. Posca gets a lot of mentions in the Roman sources. Pliny the Elder talks about it. A playwright called Plautus mentions it a few times. And also, it's clear that drinking posca, like sharing a posca with someone, was a way that emperors, generals, senior commanders could show that they had the common touch. They weren't scared to rub shoulders with the ordinary men serving in the front line. One account says that the Emperor Hadrian actually led a soldier's life and cheerfully ate out of doors such camp fare as bacon, cheese, and vinegar. I bet he had proper rations when he got home that night. The vinegar in the water, apparently, well, its sharpness would have helped disguise the taste of bad water. The acidity would have helped to kill bacteria, apparently. And according to a recent study, vinegar makes you feel more full. Hunger would have been a common complaint of Roman soldiers serving on campaigns. So vinegar makes them feel a bit more full. No wonder they add it to their wine. Wow, the aftertaste hits the back of your throat very hard indeed. Posca even gets mentioned in the Bible during one of the most famous stories of all time, when Jesus is up there on the cross. Matthew writes in his account of that terrible day, immediately one of them ran, and taking a sponge, he filled it with sour wine and put it on a reed and gave him a drink. Oh, Roman soldiers would have eaten meat whenever they get their hands on it. And we got good evidence of that from the Vindolanda tablets, these wonderful written sources found at a fort on Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain. They talk about the food eaten by the army stationed up there, particularly what the commanding officer would have eaten, a guy like me. And the answer is a lot of venison and wild boar. Let's check this out. Not too bad. Like pork, but a bit more gamey. Now we know from archaeology carried out at Roman military sites right across northern Europe that plenty of bones have been found. And from that analysis we can tell the Romans ate ox, sheep, goat, pig, deer, boar and hare in most places. Anything they get their hands on. They've even found evidence that they were eating elk, wolf, fox, badger, beaver, bears, voles, ibexes and otters. What otter tastes like? While officers like me were eating delicious treats like wild boar and any other meats they get their hands on, typical Roman soldiers probably had to make do with a lot of these vegetables. I like mushy vegetables, but if I was going to go and do a shift standing on Hadrian's Wall in a snowstorm, having spears thrown at me, I might want something a little bit more substantial in my stomach. I do like parsnip, to be fair, and I'm not alone. The Roman Emperor Tiberius was so fond of parsnips, he imported them all the way from Germany across the Alps into Rome. And he even accepted parsnips as tribute payments instead of gold from Germanic tribes. Now, according to the author Pliny, parsnips are also useful in warding off snakes and as an aphrodisiac. I wouldn't go that far, not really feeling it, but it's delicious. And it comes from a Roman recipe book put together in the 5th century. It's called the Apicius. And this recipe tells us to mash the parsnips, then add cumin, rue, liquamen, passum, oil, coriander leaves, and leeks. Serve. Goes well with salt pork. I don't have any salt pork with me today, but I have the next best thing, which is, of course, bacon, which, let's be honest, goes well with anything. It was very accessible to Roman soldiers, bacon, because it was cured with salt, and therefore it would keep well, and you could take it on campaign, and it wouldn't spoil. Delicious. Salt was so valuable to Roman soldiers because it allowed them to preserve their food. And they were sometimes paid in salt instead of money. That monthly allowance became known as a salarium, sal being the Latin word for salt. And that's where we get the modern word salary. Ah, cheese. Who doesn't love a good bit of cheese? Well, the Romans certainly did. It's one of the things they introduced to Britain, alongside the mixed blessings of central government, gladiatorial combat, underfloor heating, taxation, sewers. But the cheese, we can all agree, was a benefit to Britain. And Roman legionaries brought those cheese-making skills to this occupied territory. I think we can forgive them a lot in return for the cheese. Now, the Romans traded different kinds of cheeses all over their empire. We even know the name of the first identifiable cheese brand. It was called La Luna, the moon. So it shows that the association between the moon and cheese goes all the way back to the Roman Empire. And it's not surprising they were so familiar with cheese, because Roman soldiers would largely have been raised in rural communities on farms. They knew the process of cheese making very well. So wherever they ended up, they could settle down and start making some local cheese. The Romans were just really good at making cheese. Pliny says, in a rather arrogant way, it is a remarkable circumstance that the barbarous nations which subsist on milk for so long have been for so many ages either ignorant of the merits of cheese or have totally disregarded them. Like everything the Roman army did, it was obsessed with victory, with winning. And that really dictated how it dealt with its food. All this food is easy to store, it's pretty easy to carry with you, and it doesn't spoil. It gave the army a huge advantage. They could campaign a long way from their base for long periods of time, while the other side would run out of food and have to disperse and go and find it. That meant the Roman army would be victorious across huge swathes of North Africa, the Middle East and Europe. They could build villas like this one reconstructed here at Butser Ancient Farm in Britain. That is tasteless, cold, and that is an acquired taste
I'm Dan Snow, and today I've come to a 13th century Cistercian abbey at Beaulieu to work out just what those medieval monks would have eaten. Let's see what's on the menu. Cistercian monks were determined they would be as self-sufficient as possible. Many abbeys supported themselves through agriculture and brewing ale. There's one thing the Cistercians didn't like, it was those other groups of monks who they said had all gone soft and become gluttons. And so Cistercians ruled the monks should eat only once a day, and meat was forbidden to all apart from the sick. The Cistercians' diet largely consisted of coarse bread, but also vegetables, herbs, beans, and on really crazy special occasions they let their hair down and they might have some fish, some eggs, or other delicacies known as pittances. One of the most famous Franciscans of them all, Bernard of Clairvaux, wrote in a sermon, "I abstain from meat because by overfeeding the body I also feed carnal desires. I strive to take even bread with moderation, lest my heavy stomach hinder me in standing up for prayer." He sounds like a blast. Pottage, eaten by almost everyone in the medieval period. It's basically a soup, a stew, or throwing anything that's lying around into a pot and heating it up. It contains vegetables and grains, things like that. Often eaten with bread. So let's give it a go. That is tasteless, cold, sticky, not very nice, but it's all they had. They were popular because there were lots of variations on this. You just chucked in whatever happened to be around at the time. They could be boiled up quickly and served, or some pottages would sort of stay on the fire in a pot for days on end, and people just kind of keep adding additional ingredients from time to time. Really, this needs, frankly, anything to spice it up. Herbs that could grow here in the UK or the Northern Hemisphere are quite nice, like rosemary, get that in there. Ideally salt, but salt cost a bit of money, so that was almost a bit of a luxury back in those days. But we've also got sage and thyme. Frankly, I think the more the better. It needs every little bit of help it can get. That is an improvement. The vegetables in here might be leeks, beans, peas, cabbage, sprouts. No potatoes, of course, because Christopher Columbus had not travelled across the Atlantic yet and brought back potatoes. And it was common for monks to have these vegetables growing nearby. They had very well-tended gardens. They'd grow herbs as well there to provide flavour and also for medicinal purposes. Cistercian monks were remarkably skilled herbalists. And in many of those monasteries like this one, those herb gardens survive to this day. You can't talk about medieval food without talking about fish, particularly pickled herring. This one is in a trencher of bread. Let's give it a go. Basically herring, a lot of that in northern waters, wrapped up in bread, a plate of bread. Oh, and that is an acquired taste. Oh, it's it goes on delivering as well. You get the very strong herring taste, and the pickle really comes through. But actually, it's offset a bit now with the nice soft bread. Not too bad. Ooh. Fish would typically be eaten on feast days, so important religious days, or fast days. And there were about 3 fast days a week that Christians observed in the Middle Ages. There was a Wednesday, the day that Judas betrayed Christ, a Friday in penance for Jesus' suffering, and frankly, that is penance. Now, in addition to that, there was the marathon fish-eating period of the year, which was Lent. 40 days, no meat. Fine if you live on the coast and guzzle down seafood, but when you live inland, abstinence was on a very different scale. Week upon week of muddy-tasting freshwater fish, or salted herring and cod. Whew. Easter must have been a party. One of my favourite quotes about this is from a 15th century schoolboy who wrote in his diary, "Thou wilt not believe how weary I am of fish, how much I desire that flesh will come in again. For I have eaten none other than salt fish this Lent, and it has engendered so much phlegm within me that it stops my pipes, that I can scarcely speak nor breathe. I can see how you get like that after 40 days of this. Monks drank a lot of beer. There were hundreds of monasteries right across Europe, all brewing beers, partly because they wanted to be completely self-sufficient. It's really safer as well as nicer to drink beer in a world particularly where there's lots and lots of sewage in the water. The brewing process cleaned the beer and made it safe for humans to drink. So men, women and children all drank a lot of beer in the medieval period. Monks became well known for brewing because they followed a principle of self-sufficiency. So they wanted to make sure that everything they ate and drank could be provided by the monastery themselves. The monks made some important innovations. In order to keep up with growing demand, they figured out new ways to mass produce beer. They added hops to it to balance out the sweetness from the malt. And that also acted as a preservative, which meant in the period following the medieval period, when European sailors started sailing across vast distances towards the Americas and Asia, they could take barrels of beer to stop them getting too thirsty. I think lots of people were brewing and fermenting and distilling anything they get their hands on in this period, but monks became particularly well known for making great beer. The reason they gave was because they believed they needed to make the best product possible since they were working for God, and a subpar beer would be a major offence. Sure, lads. I'm not sure I'm cut out to be a medieval monk. I mean, I like the outdoors, I like the idea of being self-sufficient, a life of quiet contemplation, but I think the food's just a bit thin. Lots of beer though. It's kind of a weird sensation. I like it though. In fact, it's delicious.
Don't taste very nice. And they don't send you into a state.
Hi, I'm Dan Snow and I'm heading back 500 years to central Mexico to sample an Aztec banquet. The Aztecs flourished 500-600 years ago, and it reached its greatest extent, this empire, covering much of what is now central and northern Mexico. The empire was led from the magnificent capital city of Tenochtitlan, and that emerged the dominant force in Mexico. It developed social, political, religious, and commercial systems that sort of brought many of the region's city-states under its control. That all came to an end when the Spanish invaders arrived, led by the conquistador Hernan Cortes, who overthrew the Aztec Empire by force, capturing Tenochtitlan in 1521, which became Mexico City. In the heyday of the empire, most Aztecs spent their days working the fields, cultivating food for the inhabitants of Tenochtitlan. Since it was easier to grow crops than hunt, the Aztec diet was primarily plant-based and focused on a few major foods. You got maize, you got beans, and you add salt and chili peppers. Those are the constants of Aztec cuisine, providing the average Aztec with a well-rounded diet. Food played a really important ceremonial role in Aztec culture as well. Feasts were determined by the religious calendar and were used to display wealth. They featured singing, dancing, storytellings. They burned incense, they offered to the gods. There was tobacco and flowers and gift giving. Festivities would begin about midnight. Some attendees would drink chocolate and consume hallucinogenic mushrooms so they could describe their experiences and visions to the other guests. Cannibalism was deeply rooted in Aztec mythology. The Aztecs believed that gods and goddesses needed to consume sacrificed flesh and blood of humans in order to sustain themselves and the world. Now, since human flesh was seen as the food of the gods, ritual cannibalism had a sacred meaning, bringing the consumer closer to those gods. So you'd have the victims, usually prisoners of war, they'd be sacrificed in public on top of the pyramids and temples by having their hearts cut out. Their bodies would then be thrown to the ground where they were dismembered, and the bits of them could be distributed to the elite and then consumed in stews, often flavoured with salt and eaten with tortillas. Luckily today, I've just got frog's legs. The Aztecs raised turkeys for meat and eggs. In fact, the bird was so important they turned it into a god. They called it the jeweled bird, a god of both plague and purification. This is one of the Aztecs' greatest contributions to world cuisine. All the Aztec dishes were cooked on a flat, round pottery griddle called a comal, and they still use them in rural Mexico today. And it's with the comal that the Aztecs made the so-called tlaxcali, which their conquerors called the tortilla, which is Spanish for little cake. Let's try this turkey tortilla. That is delicious. We really should eat turkey more often and not just save it for Christmas. So in Nahuatl, which is the Aztec language, the word tlaco means middle. Now, the best way to enjoy a tortilla is something in the middle of it, and that apparently is where we get the modern word taco from. 16th century Spanish chronicler portrays a really dizzying array of possible taco fillings, all of which were available from a local market. At Tenochtitlan, modern-day Mexico City, you could choose between vendors selling tacos filled with vegetables like beans, squash, tomatoes, cactus, or meat, your dog, rabbit, turkey, etc. But perhaps the strangest filling was down on the lakeshore itself, where you'd have water insects, certain amphibians, and even algae. However, all of these would have been deliciously spiced with the seasonings that the Aztecs loved, like salt and chili. This one I'm trying today is turkey, tomato, pepper, flavoured with a bit of chili, epazote, and salt. And it's delicious. Well, eating this reminds me, no European, African, or Asian had ever tasted a tomato before Christopher Columbus sailed across the Atlantic and bumped into the Americas and brought back a whole different bunch of food. The Aztecs saw the frog as Tlaltecutli, who embodied the endless cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Her name means the one who gives and devours life. She represented Earth and the sky and was one of the Aztec gods most hungry for human sacrifice. Let's give this a go. Tastes a bit like chicken, but sort of crossed with fish. Perhaps surprisingly, it's about halfway in between. Frogs and toads were very common in the basin of Mexico, so it's no surprise they played a big part in Aztec mythology. And toads had another important role in sort of Aztec religious practices because they secreted a kind of poison on their bodies that could cause hallucinogenic states and would be used in ritual practices. That poison, that substance, is called bufotenin, and it impacts your cardiovascular system, and it's deadly if you have too much of it. Now, the act of getting high off these toads was restricted to the priests, high people in the social hierarchy, and that allowed them to sort of interact with the gods in a way that ordinary people couldn't. Ordinary folk had to stick with frogs, which is what I'm eating today. Don't taste very nice, and they don't send you into a state. The most important Aztec staple was definitely maize. It was a crop held in very, very high regard. It played a central part in Aztec mythology. When the Europeans first arrived, the Aztecs described it as our precious, our flesh, our bones. Maize came in a variety of different colours and textures and sizes. You could eat it in all sorts of different ways. It could be eaten as corn tortillas, tamales, or atole. This, a maize gruel. It was pretty good. So what you do, you get your maize kernels, and then you dried out, and then you soak them and cook them in an alkaline solution, usually lime water. And you get this rather nice porridge. Maize was so important that there was a sort of religious calendar around its harvest cycle. They created gods and goddesses to represent the maize in its various stages of development. There was a young goddess or god for young maize, and then when it was old, the seeds were dried, it was represented by an old goddess. It would have been a popular breakfast in Aztec times. It was served warm with milk, cane sugar, cinnamon. Definitely take the chill off in the morning. I wasn't looking forward to this. I didn't think I was going to enjoy it, but I've been amazed. Now for the highlight, hot chocolate. Remember, no one from Eurasia, Africa had ever tasted chocolate before the great Columbian exchange that followed European explorers heading to the Americas. But the Aztecs have been enjoying hot chocolate for generations. Oh, that's delicious. But it's different to the way that we used to enjoy chocolate. They didn't eat them as solid bars. They enjoyed chocolate as a frothy drink made from cocoa beans. Chocolate was used in their religious observances. It was used to mark betrothals, marriages, other big milestones of life, a little bit like we do today. It was also a key feature of the big festivals that brought everyone together, dancing and singing. Everyone's having a great time when you throw chocolate into the mix. And those clever Aztecs used chocolate as medicine. They mixed it with loads of other ingredients. This one's actually got chili in. I can really feel it at the back of my throat. It's great. And those ingredients varied from tree bark to opossum tails, depending on what it was supposed to cure. Chocolate was said to be pretty much good for anything. It treated digestion problems, infections, fever, or heavy coughs. I can see why they thought that. I've never had hot chocolate that's got chili in it before. It's kind of a weird sensation. I like it though. Cocoa was available to common people from time to time, but it was really associated with the Aztec elite. The ruler and his entourage drank it off their meals. They made it a kind of, medieval Mexican equivalent of an after-dinner coffee or mint. Chocolate was a status symbol consumed by the wealthy. It was even given to warriors as a reward for acts of valor in battle. You can either have a little medal or a big mug of hot chocolate. What do you prefer? Now, perhaps the most notorious Aztec chocolate lover of all was the Aztec ruler Montezuma II, who allegedly drank gallons of the stuff each day for energy and as an aphrodisiac. Montezuma called this the divine drink, which builds up resistance and fights fatigue. A cup of this precious drink permits a man to walk for a whole day without food. I wouldn't go that far, but it's tasty. Aztec food is so remarkable. It existed on the same planet, but completely distinct from Eurasian and African food. And yet now it's so familiar, as Aztec ingredients like tomatoes and chocolate have spread all over the world and are essential staples to so many of us. Thank you very much for Butser Ancient Farm for letting me come and try my Aztec banquet.
Watch out, Congreels, you might be back on the menu.
And it is absolutely delicious.
Hi, I'm Dan Snow, and today I'm going to be experiencing a Tudor meal fit for a king.
The Tudor period is named after the House of Tudor, the ruling family that held the English throne from 1485 to 1603. And the most well-known member of that dynasty is Henry VIII. Henry VIII's reign is often remembered for his 6 wives and his rather full figure. But why was Henry so overweight? Well, one of the reasons is likely to have been his very hearty diet. Henry regularly feasted on roasted meals and fatty fish, and is said to have loved snacking on sugary treats. Today I'm going to unfasten the belt a few notches and find out what would have been on the menu at a Tudor royal banquet.
First up, the meat of kings, venison. From deer, of course, and all aristocrats and kings loved going out for a day's hunting. Several of them had unfortunate hunting accidents that cost them their life. My trusty knife, no forks in Tudor times, none of that namby-pamby stuff. Just eat it with your fingers. Now, this is a dish that has aged well. Still love venison. Well, interestingly, you couldn't buy deer meat, you couldn't buy venison. It was only consumed by those who could afford to have their own deer park. That is why it was seen as a royal aristocratic food. One could only get their knife into it if it was gifted to you or if you could afford to hunt it yourself. So, for example, Henry VIII, that incorrigible romantic, once sent Anne Boleyn, who he was chasing at the time, a dead deer carcass. Lovely. But in fact, he accompanied a note that explained his thinking. He said, "And to cause you yet oftener to remember me, I send you, by the bearer of this, a buck killed late last night by my own hand, hoping that when you eat of it, you may think of the hunter." So it was like a love letter, really. I must say, I love venison, and I would eat more of it if I could, and if I had my own deer park. Courtiers, royals like me, would have enjoyed a huge variety of food. Freshly slaughtered, roasted meat every day, the luxury even of being able to choose from a menu of different dishes. There was a lot of protein in the Tudor diet. Meals could be up several thousand calories. That's a lot more than we might eat today. I think it is true that the Tudors, including the nobility, would have needed more calories than we do, because they didn't just sit about all the time looking at laptop screens. They were out, their houses were cold, they were on horseback, they were travelling big distances on foot, they were hunting, dancing, fighting, doing all sorts. So you need to get the old calories in. This is the big one. Henry VIII ate a huge variety of food, wherever he took his fancy. We know he ate swans, he ate pies, lamb, venison, porpoise, but there are accounts of him eating conger eel. This is one of those eels. I've seen them when I've been diving off the coast of Britain, but I never thought I'd have to eat one. Right, here goes. I like the sort of congealed jelly here that's formed along the side. Whew. Might have to give that a bit of a go. But in the meantime, let's get involved. Right. It's actually not bad. It's okay. It's fishy. What do you expect? Just a normal whitefish, actually. I can get used to it. Watch out, conger eels. You might be back on the menu. It looks absolutely disgusting. Doesn't taste too bad. I remember, it was compulsory to eat fish on Fridays and during Lent. So no wonder they want a bit of variety. I'm not touching that jelly stuff though. I've seen these when I've been out diving. One almost bit my hand off when I was diving on a World War II tank off the coast of Dorset, but I never thought I'd be eating one. As you can see, I'm using my hands, a lot to eat. So there was a strict etiquette around clean hands, and you weren't really supposed to just like go and handle other people's food. Sweet potato, an absolute favourite of mine, and also Henry VIII. This was brought over from the New World, post-Christopher Columbus. This delicious sweet variety of potato, allegedly introduced to the English court by Henry VIII's long-suffering Spanish wife, Catherine of Aragon. It was said that Henry could eat over 20 of these in one sitting. And actually, I agree, so could I. Absolutely delicious. No notes at all, Henry. He liked them so much that he apparently offered land and gold to any gardener that could grow them. The first definitive account of sweet potato in England comes from the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, who was Henry VIII's daughter. A man called Gerard Herbal, brilliant name, wrote in 1597, "Howsoever they be dressed, they comfort, nourish, and strengthen the body." So true, Gerard. To spice up Western European diets, explorers and mariners had been heading out to Asia to get, well, spices, like pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, all sorts of things. And it was on one of these journeys that Christopher Columbus accidentally reached the Americas. Before Columbus and other explorers brought back food from the Americas, there were no tomatoes, potatoes, vanilla, chocolate, turkey, tobacco, or chili peppers in Europe. Imagine that. Julius Caesar never ate a tomato or a potato. Extraordinary. Beautiful Tudor rose, marchpane. Now, I said forks weren't allowed at the Tudor court. Weirdly, there was a tradition that the king was allowed to use a fork, but only when it was sweet food. So we're going in on the fork this time. Oh, Hope it takes the eel taste out of my mouth, this. Marchpane was a kind of cakey tart, I guess, made of ground almonds, shelled, ground very fine, sugar and rosewater. And it is absolutely delicious. It's like marzipan, but slightly lighter. After you've had a bit of marzipan, you feel like you need to lie on the ground for a few hours. But I reckon you go about your daily business after this. They loved moulding this into shapes, like this lovely Tudor rose here, and they coloured it and they coated it with fruits and other comfits, which is nuts or seeds coated in sugar. Basically, folks, the Tudors loved sugar, which was increasingly grown in plantations of enslaved people in the Atlantic and the Caribbean. Elizabeth I ate so much sugar that her teeth rotted out and her breath stank, apparently. Having said that, I could eat this all day. Now, the Tudor court was famous for drinking vast amounts of beer. 600,000 gallons of beer every single year, according to the accounts. That's about, well, nearly £6 million based on today's money. Now, to drink that much beer, we've worked out that each of the 1,200 or so people at court would need to have consumed an average of 10 pints every day. Now, the beer was watered down, but still a lot of booze. The Tudor period saw England develop into one of the leading European powers, extending its territorial ambitions beyond the familiar shores of Europe. This increased wealth and power was evident in dining halls across the country, with new foods available and an increasingly decadent attitude towards feasting, at least for the wealthy. I'm getting a bit worried about Georgian gut health, to be honest. Sweetbreads sound so nice and delicate, but in fact, they're awful. Hi, I'm the extremely eligible Dan Snow with 1,000 a year to my name, and tonight I'm a guest at a Georgian dinner party. The Georgian era was a period in British history from 1714 to 1837, named after the four Hanoverian kings, George I, George II, George III, and George IV. It was a time of great change for the nation, and it saw Britain establish itself as an international power at the centre of an expanding empire. This expansion, combined with the impact of the Industrial Revolution, led to an increase in wealth and the creation of a middle class keen to show off just how much money they had. And a good way for them to do this was by hosting parties and serving luxury goods and food items, ideally from British territory around the world. Formal dinners and balls were popular as a way both to show off one's wealth and for men and women to meet and mix with each other in a time when relations between the genders were restricted. This is the Georgian era that we know so well from Jane Austen, period dramas like Bridgerton. But what would middle-class guests at a Georgian dinner party have actually been eating? Let's find out.
There's a variety of cold cuts and meat pies, plus a sumptuous platter of white soup, a staple of the period. There's a delightful bowl of sweetbreads, or as you and I would call them, offal. And to finish, a bite of juicy pineapple fresh from the tropics.
A Georgian dinner party was quite a do. The tables would have been groaning with food, several courses and different dishes in each course. Guests who sat down would have soup, meat, game, pickles, jellies, vegetables, custards, puddings, perhaps 5 dishes, perhaps 25, depending on the grandeur of the occasion. Now, of course, for a country that was constantly at war with France in the 18th century, French food was the height of fashion, and you had to have a French chef, darling. You can tell a lot about Georgian sensibilities and food from reading Jane Austen. She creates a character in Pride and Prejudice called Mrs. Bennet, who is hyper socially aware. This is what she had to say about the food at one of her neighbours' parties. The soup was 50 times better than what we had at the Lucases last week, and even Mr. Darcy acknowledged that the partridges were remarkably well done. And I suppose he has 2 or 3 French cooks at least.
Austin teaches us that dinner parties in the Georgian era were less about making guests feel comfortable and feeding them excellent food, and more about status and one-upmanship.
White soup was to a Georgian do what punch is to a frat house party. White soup was meat stock, egg yolk, ground almonds, cream, occasionally a bit of bacon, and it was served at balls. Let's give it a go. Gamey. It's gamey soup, if you can believe that. It fortifies you though. You could tell you'd be ready for a whole night on the dance floor after that. Jane Austen says that white soup was so important that a ball was virtually impossible without it. One of her characters planning a party says, "As for the ball, it's quite a settled thing. And as soon as Nichols has made enough white soup, I shall send round my cards." No white soup, no party. Here we go. Oh, big bit of chicken. The thing about these white foods is that, like with flour and sugar, they were historically considered, well, status symbols because they were more expensive. They needed refining, processing, and therefore they were lighter and more expensive than their unrefined counterparts. And it's possible that the reason this was like the centerpiece at fashionable parties was because you projected an image of wealth. Right, let's move on to the main course. As you can see, it involved a lot of meat. You had pies, you had hams, you had breasts of duck, poultry. Let's check this pie out here. What have we got here? Venison. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you cannot go wrong with a pie. Delicious. Dancing food. But you also get some vegetables, things like asparagus when it's in season. But meat made up a large part of the Georgian diet, even for the middle class. You got venison, game, things that could be hunted and shot. That was another way of showing off to your guests. It suggested that you had a country estate where those things could be procured, or that you'd been gifted them by some royal aristocratic friend. I'm getting a bit worried about Georgian gut health, to be honest, but fun place to visit. Now, we come on to the most bizarrely named part of the Georgian diet, the so-called sweetbreads, which sounds nice, but in fact, they're offal. They're glands. They're drawn from the stomach. In one Jane Austen book, the heroine is offered a delicate fricassee of sweetbread and some asparagus. It looks like chicken. It kind of feels a bit like chicken, but it tastes like lard or kidney or something frankly pretty disgusting. I think there's something strangely poetic about Jane Austen's characters standing around having polite conversations whilst munching on testicles and ovaries. Don't know how polite I'd be if I was eating that the whole time. So from 1815 or so onwards, you start to see a change in the way the Georgians had their dinner parties, particularly in London, which was the leader of fashion and a more formal place. Dinner parties started to be served à la Russe. That means serving food in separate courses, not just one big groaning table. Each course would be taken away and replaced with another. This method became more and more popular later in the Regency era. The Prince Regent, who would become George IV, he loved this food. And he loved a little night out as well. Now, he had a French chef called Carême, who's credited with introducing this idea à la Russe. And the upper classes always took their lead from the Prince Regent and what was most fashionable on the continent. So his method caught on amongst the nobility and gentry. From that point onwards, a formal dinner might be 2 courses followed by dessert. So we're all followers of carême to the present day. The ultimate status symbol in the Georgian period was oddly a fruit. Pineapples could only be grown in the warm tropical weather. But aristocrats here in chilly old northern Britain decided that they wanted to show off just how much money they had, the staff, the facilities, to actually try and grow these at home. If you could have a dinner party where you served homegrown pineapples, it meant you were a wealthy guy. In 1764, the Gentleman's Magazine estimated that it cost £150 to build a hothouse, to cover the running costs, to buy the initial plant stock, and all this expense, of course, was not guaranteed to give any return. Now, if you stick that through the Bank of England's inflation calculator, that's roughly equivalent today to £22,000 in order to grow some of these. Pineapples were hot property. Maids who transported them from one house to another could be accosted by thieves. In 1807, there were several court cases for pineapple theft at the Old Bailey in London. The most notorious was Mr. Godding, who was sentenced to 7 years transportation to Australia for stealing 7 pineapples. I'll spare a thought here for the aspiring middle classes who want to get ahead, but they can't get their mitts on any pineapples, they can't afford to grow them. Well, as so often with capitalism, the market responded. Canny businessmen opened up pineapple rental shops across Britain. Companies of all different kinds cashed on the fruit's popularity. You see them engraved and carved into buildings, and the market for pineapple-themed goods exploded. Porcelain makers like Wedgwood produced pineapple-shaped, well, everything really. And the beauty of all these more durable pineapples is while the fruit rotted away, the statues and carvings would always remain to remind guests in perpetuity of just how wealthy you were. Now, the Georgians drank all sorts of wine. White wine, claret, which means wines from the Bordeaux area of France. Wine is very important in a Georgian dinner party. Hey, all dinner parties, let's be honest. In 1825, Mrs. Parks wrote a book in which she talked about the kind of wines you had to serve at a dinner party. She said, the decanted wines placed on the table during dinner are white wines, either Madeira, sherry, or Bucellas. Those circulated after dinner are port, Madeira, and claret. She went on to say that claret is generally contained in a decanter with a handle and of a peculiar form. It's quite a formal setup. And it wasn't just the wine that was formal. There were even rules about who you could talk to and when. You had to have conversation only with the person on your right or your left, and therefore where the hostess sat her guests was crucial. Now, there were some informal dinners, a bit less rigid. You could talk across the table at those, really let your hair down. And you only drank wine with someone else. You didn't just sit there glugging it by yourself. Never clink glasses, though. A lady or a gentleman would raise a glass to you, and you would drink in return. A drink with you, sir. The elite of Georgian Britain lived in a world of plenty. They'd never had it so good. Certainly not true for many other people in the world at the time. And that spirit of excess was embodied in the king, King George IV, who when he died was enormously fat and weighed 24 stone. So ungainly that it gave the undertakers a real problem with his corpse. Hi, I'm Dan Snow, and I've come to a Victorian kitchen built in the 1870s to sample the food eaten by the normal men and women. Let's see what's on the menu. The Victorian era was a time of just enormous change, a really tumultuous time. Social and political upheaval. You've got the Industrial Revolution going on. You've got Charles Darwin with his ideas about evolution, transforming our vision of our place in the world. You've got railways extending out across the globe, steamships, huge era of scientific discovery. For example, you get the first telegraphs and telephones as well. And there was also a big change in diet as the rise of refrigeration led to the beginning of global supply chains. Under Queen Victoria, Britain became the world's richest country, and that gave rise to a new class of affluent people. We might call them middle class, and they all aspired to have servants. So under Queen Victoria, we see a peak in the number of servants in the UK. Most middle-class households aspired to have at least 1 or 2 servants. So in 1871, over 4% of the population were employed in service, and the vast majority of them were women. Sheep's trotters. These were a very common Victorian snack. People would sort of just munch on them a bit like a kebab, and they were a cheaper alternative to a nice cut of meat. Disgusting. I've been told that people used to rip the nails off and suck out the jelly inside. I mean, I don't even know if that's a thing. Wait, no, it's good, the sound. I can see that they are a little bit of a snack, but I would only eat these if I was desperate. Imagine little Oliver Twist gnawing one of these. Jellied eels. I'm going in. These are basically chunks of eel in their own naturally produced gelatin. First impressions, absolutely disgusting. In go the fingers. Oh my God. That is absolutely disgusting. You bite through the oily, greasy gelatin and you reach a kind of fish-like substance within it. It's dry, it tastes a bit off. Oh, it does not improve. The aftertaste gets worse and worse. These were sold on food carts in the East End of London in particular, and the dish was often flavoured with a splash of vinegar or dollop of butter, and I can see why, because the natural taste and flavour of this is absolutely disgusting. They were cheap in London, particularly at the time, because eels were one of the few animals that could survive in the sewage-choked, poisonous Thames River in that period, which is nothing more than just an open sewer and cesspit and runoff for industrial waste. So as well as tasting completely disgusting, you're also just gnawing on poisonous meat. Oh, I just can't do that anymore. Oh, God. One of the Victorians' favourite meats has fallen out of fashion now, and that's mutton. It's basically sheep, but more grown-up sheep than those that you would eat in lamb, and they liked it because it could stand up to long, slow cooking. They thought it had a richer flavour too. I mean, it does taste like lamb, just older. Even Queen Victoria wasn't above chewing a little bit of mutton. In the Royal Archives, we hear that in 1858, she ate mutton chop and mashed potatoes. And it was good enough for Queen Victoria. It should be good enough for us. Let's get mutton back on the menu. And when you look at this Victorian cooking book, you can see just how popular it was. There are no fewer, well, dozens of pages. Every single part of the sheep could be eaten, including the head, very nice, the tongue, kidneys, loin chop. So we've got mutton, mutton minced, mutton boiled, mutton broth, mutton haunch, and finally, mutton shoulder, which may be dressed in a variety of ways, boiled and served with onion sauce, boned and stuffed with a good veal forcemeat, or baked with sliced potatoes in the dripping pan. Delicious. Particularly following the marriage of Queen Victoria and German Prince Albert, the royal family started to incorporate lots of Germanic traditions in their Christmas festivities. And what could be more Christmassy than the Christmas pudding? Love this. the best part of Christmas. Let's just get these out. And of course, with Christmas pudding, one thing you have to do is put a bit of French brandy on it. Ooh, there we go. Woo-hoo. And create the old festive flame. Come on. Oh, what? It's not lighting. Oh, well, who cares? Let's get on with it. Right. Nothing better than a bit of Christmas pudding. Oh, beautiful. A lot of brandy on there. It's really Charles Dickens who cements this little bundle of joy at the heart of the British Christmas tradition. In A Christmas Carol, he writes, "In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly, with the pudding like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quartern of ignited brandy." She's better than I am at that. "And bed tight, with Christmas holly stuck to the top. Oh, what a wonderful pudding." Well done, Charles. For the British, this was so much more than just a tasty Christmas Day dessert. This was a little embodiment of empire itself. The ingredients: suet, brown sugar, raisins, currants, candied orange peel, eggs, breadcrumbs, nutmeg cloves, allspice, loads of alcohol. That was the British Empire in a pudding. A little selection of savoury and sweet treats, like Britain's colonies from all over the world, brought together for the enjoyment of people back home. So for the Victorians, they might have a nice Christmas pudding once a year, but on the whole, for a lot of the population slaving away in industrial cities or working in kitchens like this, the food was bad. Oh. I'm Dan Snow, and today I'm going to be eating and drinking like a long-suffering British Tommy in the trenches of the First World War. Let's get on with it.
World War I was one of the deadliest conflicts in history. It saw an astonishing 65 million men take part in fighting across the globe. The war, which was known as the Great War because it was so devastating, began in July 1914 and finally ended in November 1918. For the millions of British soldiers that served, life would have been extremely tough. Imagine waking up to the sound of gunfire, doing up your scratchy uniform that's been worn for weeks, and heading into battle with only a few bites of stale bread and a sip of tepid tea in your stomach. That's what life could be like for First World War soldiers. It wasn't just the constant threat of danger that made their lives difficult. Their diets were pretty bleak too.
Trench stew, or macaroni. This was the staple for the British soldiers in the trenches of the First World War. Now, cooking in those trenches is very difficult indeed, so soldiers ate most of their rations cold. If they weren't lucky enough to get a stove going, it was on a small, folding, solid fuel stove known as the Tommy cooker. Men carried them in their packs. And if they were behind the lines, a little bit further back, they might cook in pots over charcoal or scavenged wood. Oh, it's absolutely disgusting. It's basically bully beef, corned beef out of a tin with a few vegetables chopped up in there. Things like turnips and carrots. Biscuits. They were famously hard as rock. Hang on a sec, get this sort of cut them in half, then you add them to the stew. Try and make it slightly more palatable. Oh. It's just like eating cardboard. Bits of stale cardboard, if cardboard gets stale. They would try and create the stew in a small group of men that would be doled out into individual mess tins. But that's grim. They say that warmed in a tin, Maconochie stew was edible. Cold, it was a man killer. You can see why. Whoa. These biscuits so hard you could put down the front of your shirt and they'd act as a Kevlar vest. Stop bullets, that would. If you happened to be a biscuit manufacturer in 1914, then it was your lucky day. The country's largest biscuit family was owned by some peace-loving Quakers, Huntley and Palmers, and it played a crucial role in the war. It supplied vast amounts of biscuits. Less than a week after the outbreak of the war, in 1914, the factory received the first of many gigantic orders from the War Office for the manufacture of biscuits. This was basically like bread that didn't go stale. You could ship it abroad. The factory had to work night and day, 7 days a week to meet the demand. These biscuits were about 4 inches square. They were made of whole wheat flour. They had no sugar. They were very, very hard. They could be transported in bulk. And when they got to the trenches, soldiers used to dip them in water or tea and try and break them up a bit. There's a great quote from a private Pressy of the Royal Artillery. He said, "The biscuits are so hard that you had to put them on a firm surface and smash them with a stone." Look at that. I've held one in my hand and hit the sharp corner on a brick wall and it only hurt my hand. He's right. You could use that as a weapon if your bullets run out. No Brit is going to do anything, let alone fight a war, without a cup of tea. It was comforting, it was warm, gave a little reminder of home, and the tea also helped disguise the flavour of the water, which was often transported to the front in jerry cans, which had been used to contain petrol, so it tasted disgusting. Tea was also very good at helping to, well, dissolve these extremely hard biscuits. You just dunk one of these in for about 24 hours. Still hard as rock. Chocolate. Vast amounts of chocolate was transported to the trenches to try and keep up morale. In December 1914, the city of York sent a Christmas gift, a tin of chocolate to all the men from York serving in the forces. This was done, giving people a sense of home, reminding them of their friends and loved ones. Oh, that's improved my morale. We actually have a letter that Henry Bailey, one of those York lads, sent home in January 1915. He said, "I feel I ought to send my very best thanks for the nice box of chocolate I received so unexpectedly. I'm proud to be able to say that I'm a York lad and am looking forward to a speedy termination of this cruel war. I shall prize the box as long as God spares me." The rum ration. Talking Brits after all. Rum was the lifeblood of those men in the trenches. Generally, it would be doled out in the morning, although some sources say it could be given out more frequently, particularly when maybe attacks were imminent. One soldier, Charles William Nightingale, recorded that rum was issued with cheese every night during the Gallipoli campaign. But often it was given out in the mornings, so-called stand to. That's when every soldier grabbed their weapon, stood on the firing step, peering over the edge of the trench in case the enemy attacked at dawn. The writer Robert Graves noted that his soldiers looked forward to their tot of rum at dawn stand to as the brightest moment of their 24 hours. One of the many myths about the First World War is that soldiers would end up stumbling across no man's land in blind, drunk stupors as a matter of routine. But in fact, that isn't correct from what we know about the ration. The British soldier was given only 1/16 of a pint every day, although he would have made it his mission to find more. French, on the other hand, drank wine, obviously, nearly a pint every day. Cigarettes were an essential part of army life. Nearly everyone smoked. They were used as currency. 2 cigarettes, apparently, was the price of a haircut in the trenches. Given what we now know about cigarettes, seems a bit strange, but it's what you sent your loved ones to help them thrive in a very tough environment. You could buy them everywhere behind the lines, and you were issued with 2 ounces of tobacco like this every single day. People in Britain could also send their loved ones drugs, heroin, and particularly a cocaine-based med called forced march, which helped deal with hunger and fatigue. Just living, surviving in the trenches was so brutal, so extreme and hard that some historians think that the only way that they managed to convince the troops to actually stay in there was by pushing enough booze, tobacco, sugar, caffeine and drugs to the men stationed there. And having tried some of the food, I've got a lot of sympathy for that point of view.
Oh, it's like a very, very cheap, very disgusting sausage. It's just absolutely disgusting. You would have to be desperate to eat one of these.
Hi, I'm Dan Snow and I've come to a wartime kitchen to find out what an ordinary British family would have eaten during Second World War rationing. The UK had too many people and not enough food. Britain had been a big importer of food before the Second World War. And as war broke out, the British government became scared that German submarines would sink all those ships carrying food to Britain, the British people would starve, and Britain would have to surrender. So, on the 8th of January 1940, rationing was brought in. Rationing just means that people are allocated a very particular amount of food each. It's very, very efficient. Everyone got one of these ration books and had to register at their local shops. Then shopkeepers were supplied with just the right amount of food for everyone registered on their books. Ration books had a sort of coupon system, so people could only purchase what they were allotted and no more. A weekly ration was an egg, 2 ounces of butter, 2 ounces of tea, an ounce of cheese, 8 ounces of sugar, 4 ounces of bacon, and 4 ounces of margarine. Meat wasn't immediately rationed, but when it was done on price, meaning cheaper cuts quickly became very popular. Also, if you were the royal family, aristocrats, or Winston Churchill, and you had a country estate, you could have food brought into your London residence. So whilst the royal family and Winston Churchill made a big show of having a ration book, they were eating pretty well. And luckily for Winston Churchill, booze wasn't rationed. Spam. Now, spam actually wasn't on the ration. It was an American salted, tinned, processed pork that was very, very popular. Tinning was a kind of wonder technology. It meant that food could be kept good to eat for between 1 and 5 years. So spam was issued to a lot of soldiers in the field. And the Americans used it to curry favour with people back here in the UK. Let's give it a try.
It's like a very, very cheap, very disgusting sausage.
But frankly, in a world where meat is rationed, this stuff would have tasted pretty good. Bread and powdered eggs. What a treat. Right. There was actually a ban on white bread during the Second World War. Something called the National Loaf was brought in. Bakers got together and worked out how to use wholemeal flour to produce a standardised loaf. So here you go, nice brown loaf. All right, I'm going to have some powdered eggs. Eggs were rationed, so by July 1942, powdered eggs became available. Thank you to the good old USA. What you do is you dry out an egg, and then you smash it to bits. Then you keep it, and it will last for years and years. The allowance was 1 tin of dried eggs every 2 months. Now, 1 tin was about the same as 12 fresh eggs. So 12 fresh eggs every 2 months. I'm gonna go crazy and have it all in one go. You had to add water to this egg mixture to turn it back into something approaching egg. It was 1 tablespoon of dried egg, 2 tablespoons of water. If you live near the countryside and you live next to some hens, lucky you, you give up your egg ration and exchange it for other food. Doesn't taste that much like eggs, to be honest. So tasteless. The Ministry of Food was desperate to get people cooking with dried eggs. Dried eggs, they insisted, were just as good as fresh eggs and should be used in the same way. They're very useful for main dishes. That's propaganda, that is. Aha, butter, my favourite, bit of bread and butter. But of course, this isn't butter. There's a war on. Hitler doesn't let you have nice things. This is dripping. It's the rendered fat that drops off a piece of beef. Now, I think my dad must have Stockholm syndrome because he still talks about the dripping he remembers from his childhood with great affection. Let's see what it's like. It's disgusting. It tastes like rendered fat that's dropped off a piece of beef. Now, when it's hot, as you'll know from your baking tray, it's like a clear liquid. But at room temperature, it congeals, it solidifies. It tastes like a bit of plasticky plasticine. It is disgusting. I don't know what my dad's on about. It was a very versatile food or substance. I suspect you could probably use it to grease the axles on your truck, but people loved eating it in a bread and dripping form. Piece of bread, dripping on the top, a little bit of salt and pepper. Why not? Treat yourself. Okay, here goes. Meat was heavily rationed. You were allowed 4 ounces of bacon a week, and other meat was available at a price. That meant people started turning to alternative forms of meat, meat that in peacetime you would overlook as unsuitable for human consumption, and that included pig's trotters, hooves, things like that. But also whale meat. Whale meat was an unrationed alternative to meat. It was sold as whack-on, corned whale meat with its fishy flavour removed. Can't wait to try that. Let's get into these pig trotters. Oh, goodness. I mean, it's just absolutely disgusting. You would have to be desperate to eat one of these. There still seems to be mud from the farmyard caught in this trotter here. I'm not sure about this. Right, I'm done with those. One thing that was readily available during those wartime years was vegetables. You'll be glad to hear. These were not rationed. They became a mainstay during the war. People were expected and encouraged to grow vegetables wherever they could. The expression "dig for victory" was a popular catchphrase. There was a huge rise in the number of allotments all over the UK. This is a fake apricot flan. It's in fact made from carrot. I mean, carrots grew like weeds in the UK. I've got carrots everywhere. Turnips, there's plenty of those. So this mock apricot flan was cleverly designed to fool you into eating it when it was in fact carrots smeared with jam. It fooled me. In 1941, the Minister for Food, Lord Woolton, issued this clarion call for self-sustainability. He said, "This is a food war. Every extra row of vegetables in these allotments saves shipping. The battle on the kitchen front cannot be won without help from the kitchen garden. Isn't an hour in the garden better than an hour in the queue?" So true. Everyone was encouraged to start victory gardens. Dig up any patch of earth near your house and plant vegetables in it. And to use substitutes. Good old turnips, carrots, get them in the food. In the absence of sugar, which is very heavily rationed, carrots were added to desserts like this to sweeten them. And they had the added benefit, according to the government, in that they helped you see better in the dark and would protect you from bombs and during blackouts. But that's just because the government wanted people to fill their bellies with carrots. They wouldn't eat anything else. I tell my daughter that she eats the crusts on her toast, it'll make her hair curly. It's not true. And just in case you thought cartoon characters pushing annoying public information campaigns anything new, they had Dr. Carrot and Potato Pete during the Second World War. Cartoon characters to get people to eat more vegetables, as they were plentiful and cheap. Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.